It's time for another WrestlePlanet news update, as Roman Reigns rips into CM Punk ahead of his AEW debut. Tony Khan teases a history-making announcement on tonight's AEW Rampage, and CM Punk teases an appearance ahead of tonight's AEW Chicago show. All that and more coming up in today's video, but first, the ratings are in for this week's episodes of AEW Dynamite and WWE Raw. Raw drew an average of 1.857 million viewers, up from last week's 1.79 million. This shows an increase of 3.74% from the previous episode. They were also up 12.24% in the key demo, going from a 0.49 to a 0.55. This show was the go-home edition of Raw before this week's SummerSlam event, which no doubt gave them a boost. In the overall viewership for Dynamite, AEW drew 975,000 compared to last week's 979,000, which shows a tiny decrease of 0.4%. In the key demo, they scored a 0.35, the exact same as last week. This equals roughly 447,000 people in between the ages of 18 to 49, the demographic that advertisers focus on. Whilst this is the second week that AEW sit under the 1 million mark, it's not a million miles away, and considering this wasn't billed as a special edition of Dynamite like the 4 that were over a million, it can be seen as a positive. Tonight, AEW will host the second episode of their AEW Rampage show, this time presenting the First Dance special. The show will be held live from the United Center, the home of the Chicago Bulls NBA team, as well as the NHL's Chicago Blackhawks. This past Wednesday on Dynamite, 3 matches were announced, including Jade Cargill taking on the newest member of the women's division, Kiera Hogan, and Kiera recently decided to leave Impact Wrestling to become a free agent and is set to make her AEW television debut, having 2 defeats on Dark and on Dark Elevation to her name. The first match of the AEW Tag Team Eliminator tournament will go down as the Jurassic Express's Jungle Boy and Luchasaurus will battle Private Party for a spot in the finals. The winners will face either Varsity Blondes or the Lucha Brothers to decide the Young Bucks' next challengers. And interestingly, in the main event, Jon Moxley will take on AEW newcomer Daniel Garcia. This was set up on Dynamite after Garcia and 2.0 attacked Eddie Kingston and Moxley on their way to the ring. And of course, let's move on to the real main event, as it is expected that CM Punk will be making his AEW debut tonight in Chicago, Illinois. Whilst there is still no official confirmation, Punk has been teased heavily by not only AEW, but by himself on social media. Various reports state that he is indeed signed to the company and will be showing up at AEW Rampage, the First Dance. With Jon Moxley set to be in the main event, many are anticipating that a confrontation between the two could be going down. However, over the past few weeks, Darby Allin, who, to be fair, is somewhat aligned with Moxley, has been calling out the best in the world, a nickname used by CM Punk. Whilst it's not entirely clear what direction AEW will go with the debut, it's almost certain that he'll be on the show. And AEW President Tony Khan has also teased a huge announcement on the show, but we'll get to that a little bit later on. On last night's Impact Wrestling, new world champion Christian Cage made an announcement revealing that he is retiring the old TNA World Heavyweight Championship belt. Since March, whoever has been the Impact World Champion has carried the new Impact branded belt, as well as an old TNA design from before the company was rebranded. Cage cut a promo regarding the retirement and said, "It was an honor for me to take these titles from Kenny Omega and bring them back to the Impact Zone where they belong. You see, at one point in time in 2005, I walked out of the biggest wrestling company in the world. I took a chance on myself, and Impact, they took a chance on me. They gave me the opportunity to step in this ring night in and night out and up my stock and up my value to compete in main events and for championships, and that's all I've ever wanted. Now sitting here and talking about my history with Impact Wrestling, it's got me thinking, this isn't really about my history anymore. I had some conversations with Scott D'Amore and the other Impact executives, and we all agreed. As much as this TNA championship means to me, maybe it's time to set this aside and to respectfully retire this championship." Christian went on to say that he is focused on the future and not the past, and the Impact World Championship represents that. This means Cage will now just be carrying the one belt over his shoulder instead of the two that he won last week on AEW Rampage. The older TNA belt was brought back as a separate title by Moose last year, becoming the self-proclaimed TNA World Champion. Whilst the reign was unofficial, the two world titles were eventually merged in a unification match. Eventually, Swan would lose both belts to Kenny Omega, who would carry them around as part of his belt collector gimmick. Omega would then lose them both to Christian Cage last week, who now has less stuff to carry through the airport. Last night, WWE Universal Champion Roman Reigns took part in an interview with Ariel Helwani of BT Sport. They discussed the upcoming SummerSlam pay-per-view, where he is set to defend his title against John Cena in the main event. Reigns was then asked about CM Punk and his complaints when he was in WWE towards part-time wrestlers taking the spots of those that are on the road week in, week out, and most notably, Punk was critical of Roman's cousin, The Rock. Roman had some harsh words for Punk, claiming he was never as over as the part-time guys, but understands his gripe and said, "I can see it from both perspectives, but I think you said it before, that high tides raises all the boats and everybody benefits. So I do think there's that strange threshold, but I think those statements are coming from bitter people who possibly thought they were better than they really were." When it comes down to it, CM Punk was not as good or as over as John Cena, wasn't as good or as over or moved the needle like The Rock. It just was what it was. From a full-time performer, I understand the frustrations and wanting more, but like I said before, you gotta take it. I'm a full-time performer, but I've done everything that needs to be done to stay in this position, to be in this position, to continue to make an opportunity for myself to be in the main event at SummerSlam against a John Cena. This is pretty ironic considering Roman has only been over for about a year and it took no crowds to do so. Claiming Punk wasn't or isn't over doesn't make a lot of sense considering he's been the most talked about thing in wrestling since mid-July, and that's before he's even showed up. And he's clearly ignoring the fact that when WWE finally gave CM Punk the ball, he was on par if not outselling John Cena in merchandise. And also Punk did also main event a SummerSlam against a John Cena. Either way, heel Roman is great and so is Punk, but let me know what you think of Reigns' thoughts in the comments down below. AEW President Tony Khan continued to hype tonight's AEW Rampage on Twitter yesterday, teasing the biggest announcement in AEW history. Khan revealed that whatever this news is will build through to the AEW All Out pay-per-view on September 5th. Khan tweeted, "I'm betting that the excitement from the most anticipated announcement in AEW history at AEW Rampage The First Dance will build up through All Out on pay-per-view. We'll make new fans, plus we'll welcome dormant wrestling households worldwide back into the fold. A new era in AEW begins tomorrow." I think by now everyone knows that this announcement will involve CM Punk, but it's still not entirely clear how he will debut or what the announcement specifically will be. It could be perhaps the reveal of his first match, which is likely to take place in 2 weeks' time at AEW All Out. Either way, AEW and Tony Khan continue to go all in on tonight's show, not backing away from adding fuel to the fire. And before we get into the final story of the day, if you fancy it after this video, make sure you check out my video where I discuss CM Punk's secret returns to wrestling, with 2 known appearances, one in 2015 and the other in 2019, both under a mask. There is also said to be more. But yeah, that's if you fancy it after this video, but let's get into the final story. This morning, CM Punk continued to tease his AEW debut at Rampage The First Dance after he posted the opening to the Queen song Don't Stop Me Now. This was accompanied by the cover for the comic book The Dark Knight Returns, which sees Bruce Wayne come out of retirement to once again become Batman. Not to mention the lightning bolt, which is a reference to the AEW Rampage branding. As many of you may well know, the Don't Stop Me Now song opens with the lyrics, "Tonight I'm gonna have myself a real good time, I feel alive." Now, it doesn't take a rocket scientist to tell you what this post could be suggesting, with AEW Rampage being held tonight from his hometown of Chicago in the United Center, the home of the Chicago Bulls. This post follows CM Punk references from AEW themselves, as well as teases from Punk regarding a return to wrestling on his social media pages. Not only that, but it has been widely reported by multiple sources that Punk is indeed already under contract with All Elite Wrestling, with his debut imminent. That mixed in with the Chicago Bulls link, as well as Punk's social media story where he posted the song Sirius by the Alan Parsons Project, which was used by the famous Michael Jordan's Bulls team of the 90s on their way to the court, tells you everything that we need to know ahead of tonight's show in the home of the Bulls. And before you go, make sure you check out my video where I discuss the secret wrestling returns of CM Punk during his so-called retirement.